It is April 19th, 2023, and you have found the Living Youth Podcast. Mr. Robinson, how are you doing?
I'm doing very well.
Oh, I am doing very well as well.
Love the spring weather.
Love the spring weather. Warmer than where it is our guests are from today. Today is one of those episodes where we have guests for you. We like to talk here on the Living Youth Podcast about how to think biblically, but we also like to help you guys see the work and the churches, what the church is doing on a larger scale. And so we have two guests from a very distant land. Why don't you both say hello, gentlemen?
Hello.
Oh, very nice. We have Mr. Michael Heykoop and Mr. Javid Khan visiting from Canada, and we're going to ask them to tell us all about the work up north.
Looking forward to it.
Let's do it. We do have guests with us today. All the way, we wanted to give you a sense of the exotic and the strange, so we searched the wide earth all over and found these two fellows from the extremely exotic land of Canada. To my right is Mr. Michael Heykoop. Mr. Heykoop, why don't you say hello?
Hello, everybody.
And to my left, we have Mr. Javid Khan. Mr. Khan, why don't you say hello?
Hello, everyone.
Anytime we have an opportunity to pull a guest in so that our listeners and the younger in our audience can learn a little more about the church and how it's constructed, and other regions in the world that do quite a bit of work outside of the U.S. And the Canadian office is one that a lot of people don't realize is really, it depends on how you would want to define it. If you even just went by magazine circulation, for example, is the second largest behind the U.S.
Yeah, in terms of a segment of the work. Yeah.
And I was really quite intrigued when I found out how large the Canadian office was, frankly, and how much work was done there. So along those lines, I thought we might start off by asking Mr. Heykoop if he could just outline briefly for our listeners who probably know very little about the Canadian office, as I did when I came to work for the church. What projects do you work on up there, and what things are done that the average listener wouldn't know about?
Well, thank you, Mr. Robinson. In Canada, we have the opportunity, the privilege to serve about 40 million of people across the country that we're trying to reach, trying to preach the gospel to. And so many of the aspects that we've designed in order to do that has been built upon the work that's being done here in Charlotte. So we actually print a lot of the booklets there in Canada that are used for Canada, but also for other countries around the world. We print and ship booklets to the United Kingdom, to Belgium, to the Netherlands, to much of the French-speaking world as well. We do produce a Canadian television program, which is aired on certain stations within Canada. Certain stations that we wouldn't be able to air the Charlotte program on are able to air the Canadian edition of the program. We have 40 congregations across the country with an average attendance of approximately 900 people. So it is a growing work, a burgeoning work. When Mr. Weston was up here, when he started, we had about 350 in Canada. So we've grown almost 3 times the size we were when he originally came, which has certainly been just wonderful to see.
Yeah, it has been. You know, that was shocking to me, like Mr. Robinson said. I knew you guys worked hard up there because you're hardworking guys, but I had no idea how much the work uses Canada to serve all of these other areas, printing in all these other languages, and it really was impressive.
Well, one of the things that is not, I would say generally not immediately obvious, is actually what a fantastic area to ship around the world Toronto is. They're in Mississauga. Where's the port actually?
The port's in Toronto.
The port's in Toronto. And at the time, I'm a little rusty on what the pricing is, but you could in many cases ship more inexpensively from Toronto to. We ship shipments regularly to Europe and South Africa. I don't know that you guys go to Australia, maybe occasionally, but it was just a fantastic port of call to send around the world. And in fact, I would say, so here in Charlotte, we primarily do all the U.S. and English publications, but Canada does almost all the international printing from what I know. All the European offices. I think maybe Australia we actually distribute from here.
You're right. We don't print for Australia.
Yeah. Well, that's just y'all taking advantage of the Great Lakes, a resource that we share between our two countries. You mentioned something that actually might be something that our listeners don't understand. When you talked about the telecast, and by the way, I should mention that Mr. Heykoop, you can see him on the telecast from Canada, if you just go to the website, tomorrowsworld.org, and look for, you can always tell their programs because they have a cute little Canadian flag. I say cute, I'm not trying to diminish it in front of you guys, but they have the Canadian flag there in the corner, and you can find one of Mr. Heykoop's, and you can freeze frame it and look at it awkwardly while he's talking. So feel free and do that. But you'll see Mr. Heykoop there on the program. If he looks like Mr. Wahovich, you're looking at the wrong one, and you get one that has Mr. Heykoop. But what you said there was that the Charlotte program can't be aired on some stations, and a lot of our, the program here is for teens and young adults in the church. They might not know why that is. Why would that be that it's helpful to have a Canadian program?
So essentially, Canada has a tremendous benefit and a tremendous weakness in that it has this massive superpower to the south of it, which is kind of an all-consuming force. And essentially, in order to preserve, in an attempt to preserve Canadian culture, the government's mandated that a certain amount of programming has to be produced by Canadians within Canada and meeting certain specifications. And so for years, our television agents would tell us that there were certain doors that were not open to us because we didn't have Canadian content. So because we record a program, we do all of the work for it within Canada, we're able to get that designation, and that's allowed us to get on stations that we otherwise wouldn't be, because it's a benefit to the station. They can go and look and say, look at all this Canadian content that we have on us. It allows them to slot American programs in other slots.
Right. Yeah. It's difficult. We're actually talking about this. They're here visiting and checking out a lot of different things here while they're here at the office this week. And I don't think it's that our content is any better. I think it's just so vast. I mean, America just pouring out content constantly. And so good for you guys pushing back a little bit and creating your own terrible content, not as the telecast, but as Canada as a country. That made it sound like I'm talking about the telecast. That's fair. Your own Hollywood kind of stuff, and pushing back against our own rot with your own rot. And I would have to say, having visited Canada, I wasn't making fun of the flag. I was talking about the flag in the corner we put there for you guys. But I have never seen a country as excited about their flag. I come from Texas. Man, we put flags on everything, right? And car dealerships, giant flags in the wind. And I always thought there was no place on earth that loves their flag more than Texas. And then I went to Canada, and man, you guys love your flag.
Everything I designed for Canada, which it's been a while, it's like, where does the maple leaf go? It's got to be on there somewhere.
Is there a reason for that? Is there a reason why you think your country loves your flag so much?
Well, branding is important, and as a country, we've taken that very seriously. I think in part, so the Canadian flag is actually fairly new.
Really?
It was, I believe, 1967 was when it came on. It replaced a version of the Union Jack, which is now the Ontario provincial flag, and it's allowed us. And I think in part of that, it was a symbol of distancing ourselves from the United Kingdom, but also as kind of separating ourselves from the U.S. as well. It's a bit of an identifier, and again, with being the smaller country next to a larger one, anything that can identify us tends to hold sway, tends to be popular.
Oh, I can imagine. Well, anyway, it was great to see. Frankly, it was very nice. Let's go and move on to the next question, because we like Mr. Robinson was saying at the beginning, the podcast, the overall theme of the podcast is trying to help our youth think biblically. But anytime we have an opportunity to open the doors to the rest of the work and the people who are behind it, we try to take advantage of that. We've had Mr. Nathan on and a number of others. And so we want to ask both of you, and we'll start with you, Mr. Khan, in terms of how did you come to be working at the Home Office? One, who are you? Who are you? Well, introduce yourselves a little bit, and let us know how was it that you came to be? Was it an accident? Did your car break down in front of the Home Office and you just came in and asked for a job? Now, how did you come to be working at the Home Office there in Canada?
Actually, thank you, Mr. Smith. That's actually an interesting question. To start off, who am I? I actually started school doing architecture.
Okay.
And so architecture was a big thing for me. Actually, I was debating whether to do architecture or to become an actuary.
Ah.
Right. So my brother actually is in the process of becoming an actuary. And so in trying not to be like him, living in his shadow, I decided, hey, let me go as far away from actuary as I possibly can. And so I did architecture. And it was interesting. So the school was more on design but with the element of architecture in it.
Okay.
So basically I went to design school. And after that, living in Jamaica, because I'm from Jamaica, there were many opportunities there, so I decided to look elsewhere. Canada was one of the best options. And so going to Canada, I actually studied project management for construction. And I got a job in a construction field. Little did I know that, it would lead to something greater in the future. But I got married shortly after starting work in there, and eventually, she got pregnant, my wife got pregnant. And I was looking for an opportunity to make more money, because where I was, it was almost stagnant.
Mm-hmm.
It's a very small company and nothing was really going on there. And I was looking at several other construction companies along the way, and nothing really was working out at the time. And so we prayed about it, and we left it to God. And one Sabbath they said, there's a position open at the church. I was like, let me just apply for that. And Mr. Goss and Mr. Heykoop, and I think Mr. Wojovich interviewed me, and the rest is history, I guess. And
So what were some of the first projects you worked on when you started?
The first thing, I think that originally I was hired to do viewpoints, to edit viewpoints.
And we hear from a lot of younger people who just really love those.
The Viewpoint
thank you.
originated in Canada, right?
It
Yeah, it's
originated
still
in Canada,
made in
yeah.
Canada,
It's still
yeah.
made in Canada. I was not the originator of it. I think quite a few people in the office came up with it.
Yeah, it was primarily Jonathan Riley.
Jonathan Riley came up with it. Shout out to John Riley, wherever you are. But Viewpoint was the main aspect of coming into the office, starting editing, which is, recording the actual person, then adding graphics and mixing the audio, everything like that. And I think that eventually morphed into helping out with the business office there as well. Again, Jonathan Riley was one of the guys who was doing the business office, and he started working for you guys. So Canada needed someone to do the business office as well, and so they added that to the list. And then as time went on and the roles started to morph again, I got more involved in viewpoints, as well as trying to advertise on Facebook and social media. Trying to get stuff done.
And you've done actual presentations on the Viewpoint as well.
We don't have to talk about that, but yes, I have.
So our young listeners also, if you want, when you're done staring at Mr. Heykoop, you can find a Viewpoint video with Mr. Khan, and you can stare at his frozen face while he's talking as well.
And we should actually mention as well that he did get to put that architectural and design bit to use. The office moved, and Javid did most of the design for the office, which really turned out
Did you
beautiful.
really? Oh, that's fantastic.
Yeah, I must say, my wife, actually, when she came to Canada, she came a year after me. She studied interior design at school there. And so, working on the viewpoints and everything, I figured, hey, she could just draw this up for us. And everyone was okay at the office with doing it. And so she along with myself, we did some of the drawings for the office.
Oh, that's fantastic. I did get to visit the office there in Mississauga, but have not been to the London office yet, and would love to get to do it. And all the more knowing you guys worked on the design there, that's really neat. Yeah. So Mr. Heykoop, what about yourself? How did you get wrangled into working for headquarters, and who are you there?
So essentially, through college, one semester in college, I found that I did have a day when I didn't have any classes. So I mentioned that to someone that was at the office at the time, and just offered to do some volunteer work. And so I did that for a semester. Then maybe a year or so down the road, after I'd graduated, I worked for a series of ministries, the government operations within Ontario, the Ministry of Transportation, Ministry of Labor.
It's good to clarify that for American listeners. You
Yes.
say ministries, and they're thinking all these religious ministries, but
yes,
outside of here, they call that government. That's
government organizations in Ontario are called ministries. So I worked for 3 different ministries, and then I actually asked Mr. Weston, approached him about baptism counseling. We did a very Canadian thing of we met at a Tim Hortons, did the counseling session, and I still remember at one point he kind of closed his Bible and moved it over to the side and looked at me, and I could tell the conversation wasn't done yet. And he said, well, what do you think about coming to work for the church? And so I went in for baptism counseling and came out with a job offer, which was, I think, a bit of a unique experience. Was originally hired as a network technician. The last line in my job description, he snuck in something along the lines that said, and whatever else we have that may need to be done. The end of that job description became 98% of the job, and it just over time, it's as Mr. Khan mentioned, we're an office with few people in it, trying to get a lot done. So hats are multiple and varied and changed over time, but certainly have enjoyed my time there.
Oh, good. And what were you in school for?
So I studied systems analysis.
Wow.
You know, Americans, we don't have much perspective outside our own country, and so we tend to stereotype every other country around us. And you know, we all know that Canada, and so this is actually a truth. I'm not making in jest here. My favorite Tomorrow's World magazine article of all time was Mr. Wahhabit's "Consider the Beaver." And so Americans, we don't know a lot about Canada. What's something you could tell us about Canada for our listeners in particular that they might not know that's interesting? I remember when my 1 year at Ambassador College, there was a Canadian there that gave a speech, and his speech was how Americans assume you can drive up in the summertime and go skiing, which I have to admit, I did think that, but that just goes to show you how ignorant we are. I know much more about Canada now from having watched a number of various bushcrafters, lots of bushcrafters in Canada. So they go film themselves out either camping in one way or the other or crafting some kind of shelter. And Canada is varied and beautiful. But what's something maybe you could share with our listeners that's
Might surprise us about Canada.
Mm-hmm.
Well, despite being unclean, beaver is delicious. And no, of course,
This is we need to edit in there. There's got to be a disclaimer guy.
Well, he meant beaver tails, which is
that's different.
the awesome thing.
That's right. That's right.
I think one thing that I always run into is just the vastness of Canada. And oftentimes you'll speak to someone from the United States and they'll be, oh, well, do you know so-and-so from Canada? And well, they may live in Vancouver, which is quite far away from Toronto. Even the province of Ontario, where we are, one of the congregations that I help out with is in Thunder Bay, which Charlotte is closer to London, Ontario than Thunder Bay is.
Wow.
But it's still within the same province. It's just a vast piece of territory.
My understanding is it's something like 80 or 90% of Canadians live within 100 miles of the U.S. border. Does that sound right?
Yes, I was born 10 minutes from the border.
Wow. Well, so Mr. Khan, you having come from outside of Canada, especially a warm climate like Jamaica, other than the weather, what are some of your, like, when you moved to Canada and you lived there for 6 months, what are some things that you had no idea? You knew it was going to be cold in the wintertime, but
if you want to rag on the weather, I'm here for it. Just so you know,
we're from Texas, so
that's right. So
we're not about the long winters.
Actually, the weather was more a thing for my wife. We actually started dating before I told her I was moving to Canada. So we started dating, and I was like, hey, I'm moving to Canada, and she was really upset. And so I told her if she really wanted this to happen, she has to move to Canada with me. I came for school, and then she came the year after for school as well. And then we got married the year after that. But she was terrified because all she thought Canada was basically a land like just tundra, just cold, blizzard, ice.
like Antarctica or the
yeah.
North Pole.
So when she came here, she was surprised that there was actually summer in Canada, which was funny, but it was her realization that it's not that bad. But for someone outside of Canada coming in, and I guess anyone from like a third world country coming into a first world country, it's just that one, it's a culture shock, and two, just the amount of things that is possible within Canada. I guess you guys could relate to this being in the U.S., but someone from outside of the U.S. looking in, there's so much more ease of life and opportunity within nations like the U.S. and Canada. And again, that's one of the reasons I left Jamaica in the first place, is to look for opportunities. I mean, my goal was always to, not main goal, but I always wanted a family, start a family, get married. And, dating my wife before we moved, I mean, we had no idea how that was even going to be possible.
Mm.
And then moving to Canada with all the opportunities that is possible there. I mean, sometimes the people who actually live in the country, take it for granted. But when you don't have the opportunities elsewhere and you come into a country that it's just there right in front of you, it's shocking, and it's a nice thing to have.
One of the things I didn't know about Canada until recently is apparently Canada, just in general, Canadians struggle to have enough children to have a replacement population, and they rely on, it's actually a strategy to have immigration. So I guess in the like Vancouver on the western side, a little more Asian immigration, but that is an actual strategy to keep the population up.
Yeah, so Toronto, a few years ago, an article was published in the Toronto Star that pointed out that 53% of people who lived in the city of Toronto were born outside of Canada.
Wow.
And I'm one of them. Actually, that's one of the reasons, and that's one of the methods I actually came into Canada. That's why I say Canada was one of the best options, considering where to go besides Jamaica. Canada has a generation gap, and so they needed young people with enough skill set and knowledge and education to try and contribute to the economy over there. And so moving to Canada was one of the easiest processes that I've ever gone through. I mean, there were trials in between and everything, but from start to finish, it was pretty seamless.
They make it easy because they want to have you there.
For the most part. I hope so.
And one of the differences between Canada and the U.S. is how Canada's approached immigration now. There's pros and cons to this. The U.S. historically has built itself as a melting pot where everyone comes together and kind of creates something new, whereas Canada's usually used the term mosaic, where everyone comes, keeps their culture, and you go through Toronto, there's Little Italy, there's Little Portugal, there's Little India, there's Chinatown, there's
the French Canadians.
There's the French Canadians, there's just about every ethnicity kind of has its own corner of the city, and really they strive to preserve their culture that way and kind of collaborate into something interesting.
So I've been listening to one guy in particular, but he's not the only one that talks about. This podcast is morphing into one on population densities, but a lot of people don't realize how much birth rates have slowed down across the entire world. And there's only, I forget what the third one is, but he said there's only 3 or 4 countries that have a replacement population. France,
that is a reproduction rate.
There's enough
that can
kids
replace
coming along that will replace the current generation. Like China is shrinking. Japan's very much has a population problem, but it was France, the U.S., and Mexico had replacement generations coming up.
Interesting.
Actually, interesting along that line, Mr. Rohovich recorded, and I think it's been published, a viewpoint on population decline.
Okay, excellent.
Yeah, I think he did a full telecast.
Yeah, there's a full
about,
telecast on it as well.
Yeah, they're on it in Canada. So.
Of course, that's why we wanted to talk to him.
Okay, actually, speaking then of population expansion, you guys and your families have done your share to keep Canada going. You're both parents of young children. You don't need to tell us their names and social security numbers or the equivalent or anything like that, but still, if you wouldn't mind letting us know how many kiddos do you and your spouses have, and what are your thoughts about rearing children today? I know it sounds like a broad topic, but in particular, we have our concerns in the U.S., and I think a lot of those concerns are shared in Canada, but at least what I've seen, say, out of Alberta or some other places, it does seem like that they're very specific concerns. So we would just appreciate y'all's take concerning rearing children in Canada for you guys as fathers of with small children.
Sure. Well, as was mentioned, we're both above the maintenance level of 2.1 children per woman. We both have 3 children. One thing that we've really focused on is really trying to be as engaged as possible with the education that our children are receiving, meeting the teachers, getting an open level of dialogue with them. We've drafted a kind of a form letter type thing that I actually send the teachers before the school year starts each year, outlining what we find acceptable, what we don't find acceptable in terms of holidays and holy days, things like that, just kind of helping them to realize that we are religious in nature, that we do have some things, and also letting them know that we are keeping an eye on what our children learn. Talking to our kids when they get home, asking them what they learned that day, because there are some concerns as to some of the things that are being pushed under the guise of diversity, under the guise of inclusivity and tolerance. A decision that my wife and I made very early on is that we wanted to get our children into the French immersion program, in part because there's just a tremendous benefit to learning a second language, but also it's a bit more of a rigorous education, which leaves less time for garbage. The more time that's being spent teaching them something useful, the less time there is to focus on that
Interesting
other
strategy.
stuff.
That kind of makes sense. Yeah, because it is. I remember, at least for a time, I'm not sure where the state is now, but it seemed like one of your provinces seemed like it was on the cutting edge of pronouns and trying to make sure that was really enforced in the schools. But I can't remember what province that was.
Now, there has been quite a bit of that in Ontario. Now, what we have found personally is sometimes there are stories that make the headlines,
Right,
and then there's the norm. And it really seems to depend on, you have a few teachers that are pushing it aggressively. We've been blessed with having teachers that really have not pushed it too hard, at least from what we know of. And again, keeping that dialogue open where we know what's going on really has been the key and has been one of the targets that we've set.
Good. And Mr. Khan, 3 kiddos also, right?
3 kiddos as well. I'm a bit in a different path than Mr. Heykoop, or different time of our lives than Mr. Heykoop, because our kids are a lot younger.
Mm-hmm.
My oldest is 5, and so she just started school. She's in kindergarten, and while education is at the top of our minds, we decided to send them to private school, and it's a 7th-day private school, which, I mean, you have probably, more than likely, I hope, you have none of the crazy stuff being taught in schools, but then I also have to battle on the religious front of trying to guide them in that direction as well.
Right.
And so right now we try to, as much as we can, every night when we go to bed, we'd read a Bible story, we'd have them pray with us, which is pretty funny. Having them pray, because our youngest she's just 1, and she has no words yet. So she basically, when she's praying, she says,
That still works.
That works, right?
Yeah.
She's praying, so I mean, she does try to say amen, though. She's very excited to say amen because the prayer is over, but
she knows that word.
she knows that word.
Well, Paul talks about groanings that we can't understand. Maybe that's that. But I do think that's important, because it indicates, even because Jonathan did something similar, I remember, that they understand you're doing something. This is what we do. We're all doing this, and even if they're not making words yet, they know this is what we do. This is what they're following a pattern.
Right. So we try to. We're at the stage where we're trying to teach them, who God is, and how to pray to God, and even the commandments. My oldest daughter, she knows the commandments if you ask her, but she has no clue what they are. So you're telling her you're not supposed to lie, and she has no clue what that is. So she goes out and she lies, and then you're saying you're breaking the commandment, you're lying, and it just doesn't resonate with her. She just doesn't know what she's doing.
Right.
A funny story. So she knows, do not commit adultery. She has no idea what adultery is.
Right.
And so the next day, because she memorizes the word, so the next day she's downstairs playing in her play kitchen, and she's making up a storm. She's cooking, and you're saying, well, "What are you making?" And she turned around and said, "I'm making adultery."
That's excellent. What does she? What kind of accent does she have? Does she sound native Canadian?
She does sound Canadian, yeah.
Really? When the boys were young, that was one thing I struggled with. Because also, you're trying to inculcate them on these things. Because we'd rather them have to discover these things and then learn the commandments. Far better to have the words in there and they can learn. So we had that, and I remember I don't know which son it was first. I said, "Well, what is adultery?" It's like, well. So I think our definition was it's when a mom or your daddy, husband or wife, treats someone else as their husband or wife that isn't mommy or daddy, which clearly that sounds terrible to a kid. Why would you do that? I agree, son. Why would you do that? And you don't need any more details until later, but that's good enough. That's right.
And that's the challenge that we're trying to face, is because we're trying to teach them the commandments, but how do you tell them what lying is? How do you teach a 5-year-old what lying is?
We should do a podcast on it.
Yeah.
I'm just kidding.
But that is the struggle. I remember the difficulty when, the first time, which would have been earlier than 5, kids pick up on, the devil's wavelength very quickly. And the first time I didn't know, is my child telling me a lie or not? And I don't want him to get away with it because, that's what the brain does. Like, well, that worked. I'm gonna do that again. But don't also want to punish him wrongly. And I really can't tell. And part of that just sold me on the idea that, man, God, I sure need you to help with all this because we just can't do it all. We need God to help.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
So I was just curious, maybe a last question about the education system. So in the States, it could vary widely from state to state on tolerance of homeschooling. So some states really try to limit that. They don't want you doing it. Texas was always a really friendly state, and I was just genuinely just curious about what attitudes are in Canada towards the idea of homeschooling.
About the provinces and the governments. Yeah, do y'all know by any chance?
I don't know nationwide. I know within Ontario there's quite a few people, and I think it's increasing the amount of people that are homeschooling.
So it's not difficult.
I don't. What I would say is it's possible, and it's becoming more common. It's still not nearly as common as it would be in Texas or something like that. But I think it's growing, and a lot of times they're actually using resources from the U.S. in order to do that.
I didn't know that. I know some of the other European countries really don't support homeschooling very well. And when we went to Kenya for the feast, it was a pretty big, education was a big deal in Kenya, and they had a hard time getting the kids to go to be able to attend all of the feast, for example. So the idea that you would ever homeschool was you wouldn't be doing that in Kenya, for example.
Well, and this is going to sound weird because we did homeschool. We don't anymore. Our youngest is 19, part of living education, but we did homeschool the kids. But I remember when I first heard Germany's argument, I agreed with a certain principle, but it was very much the reason that we did. In Germany, because there was a family that wanted to homeschool, and they actually fled to the U.S. during the Obama administration for, what's the word? Not amnesty.
Seeking asylum?
Yeah, asylum. Thank you for coming to Canada all the way to help me remember that. So yeah, they were seeking asylum because the German government was going to take the kids. They said you're not going to homeschool. And I don't think they were granted asylum. Actually, I think they were sent back. But part of if I understand rightly, anyone listening in Germany, you can correct me. But part of the argument was that and I can understand a little bit from their history, they don't want to enable subcultures where you've got this culture where you're not a part of the rest of us. And sure enough, a lot of bad things can start in these subcultures, and they wanted you to make sure you were a part of the German culture and not some kind of subculture. And part of why I thought that was valid technically was that's kind of the reason I did homeschool, was I wanted to do my best to actually create a subculture. And so I kind of understood that. But in a very multicultural society, it seems like it's hard to justify. But what you guys described, that's what we've said here on the podcast, that, and I even said in sermons, that God doesn't say you have to do one thing or the other. He just says you're responsible for how you bring up your kids. And so go before God and ask him for guidance and for help, and whatever it is, make sure you are involved. At least here in the U.S., I literally read something right before we started this podcast. There's so many teachers that are really ready to jump in instead, and they're ready to take your place.
It does feel like increasingly, probably your mileage varies, but there's more activist teachers now than there was before. They kind of have their own ideas when I went to high school in the 80s, and it was still pretty down the line on the teachers and the curriculum. And I mean, you always had a few that felt like kind of hippie teachers, if you will. But anyway, do we have any other questions for our Canadian friends?
Well, I don't know. I hate to put you guys on the spot because, and I don't think we pretend to our audience. We do try to be kind to guests and give them a sense of what we're going to ask them. But that said, I also did want to give you an opportunity, because this, if this is your last opportunity to speak to the whole world, meaning, a few hundred or so young people in the church, young adults and teens, and their families. And if you wanted to know one thing about the Canadian office about the work that you guys do for Canada. And like, for instance, if everyone were inspired by this podcast to go, I'm going to go pray for the Canadian work. I'm going to go drop to my knees, have my 1-year-old mumble some nonsense prayer, and we're going to pray for the work there in Canada. From either of your perspectives, what's one thing you would have them ask for? See, I totally put you on the spot for that. But,
That's a good question, though.
Oh, thanks.
Yeah, well, when you were introducing that there was going to be a kind of a bonus round here, I was expecting it to be, who are the 144,000 or some impossible doctrinal question. I would suggest that if someone's wanting to pray for the Canadian work in particular, I think praying twofold, that God continues to provide the tools necessary to go through the doors and continues to provide the open doors. We foresee needs in the future of more ministers, more capable people to work in the office, more. Just ask God to keep giving. But really, in addition to that, what I think is important to stress is that the Canadian office, it's a regional office, and we're dependent on the work that's done here in Charlotte, and we've greatly benefited and strive to piggyback on the work that's done here, and we would not be able to do nearly as much as we do without having the support of Mr. Weston, of the entire crew down here in Charlotte, and just really tremendously appreciate the opportunity to come down here, see what's being done, but then throughout the year, all the support work, all the work that's being done here that allows other work to be done around the world.
Well, thank you, Mr. Heykoop. We certainly appreciate the experimenting, the really having a passion for the work and trying to figure out just how to reach the world that you guys exemplify. It seems like definitely on a weekly basis. Mr. Khan, any particular request that you would make?
It's similar to Mr. Heykoop, and just to summarize it in one word is resources. More people to be able to do the work there in Canada, because there's quite a bit to do, not necessarily enough hands to do it. As we mentioned, sometimes we have roles morphing into other roles. And so to have more resources in that regard and in every other aspect would be really well.
For me personally, I don't know if it's come across as clearly as I hoped, though. At the same time, I appreciate your comments, but how much work and burden the Canadian office actually takes on. I mean, this has been almost 2 years ago, I think, that you guys took on printing the Canadian version of the magazine, which is about 30,000, I think. And you guys pay for that all yourself. You guys pay for all those booklets that get done internationally. And as I learned about the Canadian office, I was actually very impressed at how, from my perspective, how well it was run and how much got done for really such a very small group of people doing it. And I did hear the stories of the somebody who's working in accounting comes over and runs the camera while you guys are filling the telecast, and that everybody wore multiple hats. I mean, that was a real thing. I mean, it wasn't just like you just worked in accounting and did nothing else. You contributed in other areas, and so from my perspective, and since I have an opportunity to say it here on the podcast, you guys do a great job up there. Get a lot of stuff done without getting a lot of credit for it.
You do. Even just Ms. Robinson saying that has clarified it for me. I just recorded a telecast today. I'm hoping people get what we offer. And I realize, we have viewers all over the world and people read the magazine all over the world. And whether they're reading the Canadian magazine or the one produced here in Charlotte, there's a lot of places in the world where if they request that literature, they're getting it because Canada put it out, and because Canada paid for the printing, and Canada is mailing it to places. So you guys are up there in Canada are having a worldwide impact, and we really appreciate you guys. And thank you so much for coming and spending time with us here on the podcast.
Yep.
Thank you.
Yeah, thank you for having us.
Smith and Robinson.